There are still those who think of Canadian literature as polite, well-behaved, tame even perhaps. Barry Callaghan's fiction is not that. It is maybe anything but, and a career's worth of capturing true characters, as in his newly released All the Lonely People, offers ample evidence of that. Joining us now for more, Barry Callaghan, welcome back.
All right, glad to be back.
It's nice to have you back in that seat. As we did in our earlier interview, I want to start with a quote from Margaret Atwood's preface to your book, All the Lonely People. She writes that Barry Callaghan's characters have emotions and they have them all over the page. People cry, including men. People are sentimental and sorrowful and enraged and in love and in lust as people are. People drink. People wallow in misery and bask in pleasure. People fail. People fall apart. Life is not tidy. Is there an emotion you are drawn to in your writing?
It's almost impossible for me to conceive of people, and therefore potential characters, as lacking emotion. How to read that emotion becomes the problem. This is something I realized the first time I went to England. I went on my honeymoon in 1963. There were meeting a lot of English people for the first time. And I found that I sounded direct in what I had to say. That if I was asked a question, I told them what I thought. If I asked them a question, I was confronted by deflection, what I called deflection. What I finally came to call a death of the English language by adverb. So that if I would say, you know, what do you really think about, say, the silence of the Pope? I don't know. And I would hear, well, actually, well, I knew I was in trouble right away with actually. It would be followed by virtually or truly or whatever. Yeah. But I was not going to get a direct answer. And so for me to get hold of the emotions of those people, as I looked at them, to try and figure out what's going on underneath, you know, at first it was very, very difficult for me to figure out how to read all of that deflection. But does everybody have it? Of course everybody has emotions, and they're by and large all the same emotions: frustration, loneliness, rage, jealousy. The great emotion I have discovered great situation I've discovered that really drives an awful lot, two that drive an awful lot in life. One is boredom. You know, people do really strange things because they are bored. But even more potent, I think, than boredom, it's a close call, is the sense of being overlooked. I think this is behind a good deal of the enthusiasm for Trump among certain people. These are people who feel bitterly overlooked, that their lives have just been passed by, that no one takes them seriously for who and what they are. And people desperately want to be taken seriously for who and what they are. Even if they tell you they don't, they do. All right? This is a very powerful emotion that inhabits everybody.
But I guess it must show, because I think what you just said about Trump voters, because I think that emotion is with everybody, but it, I guess, translates differently because...
It expresses itself differently. Some people, it's, you know, I mean, heavens, it's obvious in Doug Ford. He feels overlooked and he becomes this big braggadocio, bombastic, bombinating character. But there it is. What's behind all of that? The desperate... It's in nearly all politicians. There's got to be emotion that drives politicians. The need to be recognized, the need to be noticed. Well, we all share that one way or another. And it can work in reverse too. People who want desperately to be taken seriously and noticed, and they don't either have the will to put themselves out there or the talent, and so they drive inward. And so you end up with some people who are hiding inside themselves, but it's the same thing. They're hiding because they don't know how to bring notice to themselves.
And I guess it must be, I think this is probably what makes you one of the, you're so great at your craft, because you have to translate that through words. And in the story, and one of the stories that you have in All the Lonely People, Paul Valeri's Shoe, you write that storytellers have to be optimists. Why is
Yeah.
that?
Well, you desperately have to believe that that you can bring this thing to an end, you know, which is what he tries to do, and that's a kind of strange story, I must say. It frightened me a little, that story. It's about a writer who actually eats himself alive, you know, as he tries to find the storyline of his own story. You know, it's hard trying to get hold of the emotion and the tenor of life that you want to bring into a story. And if you can't make it work, it'll drive you crazy.
Margaret Atwood pointed out that you sometimes have characters who are enraged, but there's not that much killing in these stories, with the exception of Dream Book for a Sniper. We've kind of condensed this, but can you just read?
There's one killer. What's he called? The guy who kills people with the piano wire, the gangster.
Right.
It's a little story about it. That's what he does. That's his trade.
Mm-hmm. Could you read a little from Dream Book
this
for a
is
Sniper?
a very strange story. Again, it's a story I have no idea how I came to write this story. I can tell you how it began, but why I wanted it, how I brought it off this way, I do not know. Anyway, this is an ex-Blue Beret, right? For me, this is a very, very, very Canadian. I would say this is the only story of mine that really explores a problem that is strictly Canadian.
In what way?
He's a Blue Beret, which means he's a peacekeeper. His skill is that he's a sniper. And he decides in the area of the Balkans, that's where he is, where he is a peacekeeper between warring factions who take brutality to an extraordinary degree. These people kill each other in appalling ways. And in his mind, in doing so, they have crossed the line even of warfare. They have simply become brutish and deserve to die. And he has this conversation. He's now back in Canada. He's retired. He now works. He now owns his own pest company, if you remember.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
and he's confessing he's talking to a priest, right?
He's still putting down the vermin, right?
In different ways.
And he's now having this conversation with this priest, which the priest understands immediately is a kind of confession, but not a confession, because in the midst of it, this guy, who's not a stupid man, makes the case for, together they make the case and come to an understanding of the case for his killing in terms of the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas, where Thomas Aquinas talks about intellectual virtues that have nothing to do with morality. And he's worked this out in his head that he can be a killer, legitimately, virtuously,
Kill. Yeah.
right? So here he is as this Canadian who's been a peacekeeper. He's stuck in the war in Bosnia. He's confronted by brutal men, and he determines there are 10 of them are the worst of the worst. He's going to kill them. He's an expert sniper, and he does. So what
and
you've
we'll
handed
hear about
me,
3 of them in what you read in the
what you've handed me here is a list of. He goes through a list for the priest of the 10, and how he shot them. So he says, setting up the perfect shot from a distance so that no one would know where the shot had come from. I shot them dead in their shoes. I eradicated evil. Then he cites one, the hammer. He calls him the hammer. Seated on a kitchen chair, bearded, lifted his hand. Perfect. He'd been to the market. He held a slice of bread warm from his wife's oven, then slumped over his kitchen table, bleeding from the mouth into a soup bowl. 2, the airport warlord. sitting cross-legged on a stone step to his village well, petting a dog, his string bag full of tomatoes, and then his body jerks back, the dog licks blood from his blown open throat. And then leaping ahead to 10, and finally the commandant who drowned a prisoner every day in the camp cesspool, shot as he bathed in the mountain pool, shot in the shoulders so that he could not swim to stop himself from slowly sinking. 10 times, my priest, I killed my priest. 10 people.
Thank you
Now,
very much.
what's one aspect of that I want to, the way it's written and the way he's telling the story is, it has always struck me that it would be particularly terrifying and appropriate to certain violent situations if part of the punishment or vengeance or consequence of the act of the sniper is the sniper is so far away that the people who are surrounding the man who is shot don't hear anything. They just suddenly see the bullet hit and dead. And that's why it's written that way, that he's having his soup and he's doing this, next thing, boom.
The sniper plans.
He plans it all out to kill these people.
And like in situations, I guess, that relate to some of the atrocities that they've committed.
That they have committed. So the last one, he is a man who has deliberately drowned people in cesspools. And so he catches them in a swimming pool. And he shoots them in such a way that the man will simply slowly have to drown. Right.
You read three killings, and there was 10, and some of the details are, they make your skin crawl. They make your heart just want to leap out of your chest. Was this hard for you to write that story?
Not while writing it. It wasn't hard. Afterwards, it's a little bit hard contemplating where you've been. But it's always afterwards. And I'll take it the question to a larger degree with respect to the book. Like I told you in the last program, I came to an awareness of my own sensibility as revealed through the stories when I read my first book, The Black Queen, for the first time, and discovered there was so much loneliness and melancholy among women. I had this sympathy for women. When I finally put this book together and ordered the stories as they now are, I thought, all right, now I'll sit down and read this. I haven't read some of these stories for 10 years, 20 years, Let's see what it feels like when I read these stories. Well, I got to the last third, and I started reading the last third, and I began to feel a little strange.
In what way?
Some of them are very violent. The relationships between the people. There's a story, I can't remember the title of it. It's about a woman. She likes to race her car late at night. Mm-hmm. Her husband's a cop. He's full of violence, and she's having this lesbian affair, and her son is mixed in. That's a really strange. I thought, where in the world did that story come from? What in the world was going on in my head that I was exploring that kind of violence between people? They didn't have to kill each other. It was just this violence of emotion and this coldness. And I don't know where it came from.
But you also do write about...
I write some touching, lovely stories.
You do love really good love stories, I have to say.
Yeah.
And music and lyrics show up a lot in your stories. Why does music weave its way into your prose the way it does?
There's an emotional answer and there's an intellectual answer. The emotional answer is I grew up listening to music via mostly my mother from a very early age, and I sang from a very early age. I was in the choir. I sang the solo at Christmas and at Easter in the choir at St. Peter's Church.
Do you still sing?
I do. under duress.
So you won't sing for us. No, I won't ask you that.
Don't, because I'm liable to, right? I used to have a party trick. And the trick was this. My beautiful boy soprano voice, of course, changed, but it didn't totally change. So in a sense, as a singer, I became useless. And from a period, say from the age of 12 to 20, I couldn't stay in a voice. One minute I was a baritone, another minute I
Puberty.
was a falsetto, right? So poor old Harry O'Grady wanted me to stay in the choir. We finally shrugged. He said, I can't, I'm driving the guys beside me crazy. I'm slipping in and out of voices, you know, as we sing the Agnus Dei. Well, I turned it into a party trick. I used to sing the Agnus Dei, beautiful it is, in falsetto, right? Which I can't do anymore with this voice. But up there.
Sounds good.
And, oh, I can hit the first note, right? So I do the first bit of it, the Agnus Dei, qui tollis peccata mundi. And then I would switch to the song, and as we sang in the choir, the Miserere. And I would come out of the Miserere, I go right, so.
You still got it. I mean, you sound better than I do in the shower.
So this was my, when I was in Ireland once, there was a supper for Seamus Heaney and a bunch of people out in the country. And as is the habit in Ireland, people tell stories, tell jokes, sing songs after supper. And so they said, sing. Robert Graves, the great poet, was there. So we all had to sing for Robert Graves. So that's what I did. I did my party trick. I did the Agnus Dei and the Miserere. And when I saw him 10 years later in his house in Mallorca, that's what he did. He said, sing your song for me, you know. So song has always been there with me.
You said that, was it emotionally that you said?
That's the emotional
What about
connection.
the intellectual?
The intellectual thing I can tell you in one simple phrase is what Samuel Beckett said. When you're up to, you'll forgive me now, audience, when you're up to your neck in shit, there's nothing left to do but sing, right?
I think a lot of us can identify with that, if not all of us.
I sing in times of stress and unpleasantness, et cetera, and so forth. I get into song as fast as I can.
How much a challenge is it for you to capture music, though, in words?
Well, this is interesting, to me anyway. And I would say, though you didn't ask me, that this is one of the differences between my father's prose and mine. My father had a theory about prose, which he articulated, which had to do with the idea of prose as glass. He believed that you should never, the reader should never be aware of the style at the expense of what is going on in the story. That's an idea I agree with, you know, fundamentally. That I hate writers who, John Updike is a schizophrenic writer for me. Half the time he writes a prose that just tells the story and you're not aware of him being the clever writer. And then suddenly you get Updikean prose, which I find appalling. And to my horror, not horror, that's overstating it, to my displeasure, all kinds of readers think that's when Updike's at his best. He's not at his best. That's when he's faking it. Writer to writer, that's when he's cannot tell you in all simplicity what is going on in that character. So he retreats into prose, and you get metaphors and turns of phrase and this and that. And this is what my father was opposed to as a writer. So if you read his short stories, his beautiful short stories, always what you're confronted with is a prose that seems artless. There are all kinds of idiots who want him to be artful and object because he's not being artful. He's being artless. Now, most of the time it works. Sometimes it doesn't work. That's true of all writers. But when it works and it's at its best, you're getting simply the mystery of the experience as he's giving it to you, unfettered, unfiltered by clever, artful prose. Now, I write a different prose. I write with that in mind. I want you to see, right? But I also understand that there's such a thing as resonance in prose, that an image that you see and that you describe in all its utter simplicity, in relation to another image that you see and have described in all its utter simplicity, one image can resonate with another, and that constitutes a kind of meaning. That constitutes, if it's done without affectation, a kind of music. And one can end up saying that there is that music, and then you become aware of the silence between those images, which is another kind of music. So when I'm at my best, which is not all the time. Listen, no writer's ever always at his total best. When I'm at my best, there's a kind of resonance at work in the prose, because there are certain images, there are certain ways of seeing things out there in the world that seem to be natural to my temperament. And so that I find the images for them. And those images in a good story resonate, and they create a kind of music. It's not arch or artful music, you know. My father used to have this argument, put this argument with respect to Henry James, you know, the great American writer that everybody loves. I can't read him worth a goddamn. And why? And here was Morley's answer, here's my answer. Henry James is celebrated by his admirers for what they would describe as his circling around the object, giving you more and more and more and more feel or description. And what I say to you as a writer and as a reader is he's doing all that because he can't do that. He can't simply tell you what it is. If he could tell you what it is, he would. It's the equivalent to people who say, I would tell you what I actually think if I could just find the words. Right. They don't have the words because they don't have the thought.
It must be very interesting for you as a writer to read other writers' work. But that's another conversation for another day. We have only a few minutes left. But Toronto features prominently in your stories. Yeah. Do you see Toronto as another character in your fiction?
Oh, sure. If you take all of my work, you take the stories, you take my biography, autobiography, Barrel House Kings, there's a pretty good portrait of the city. I remember when Barrel House Kings came out, which is the story of my life in this, many a person came up to me and said, my goodness, I didn't know all of that went on in Toronto in the 50s and the 60s. Wow, where was I? Well, I know where you were. You were at home, you know, doing your knitting is what you were doing. I was out having a good time, you see.
So no regrets for you? No regrets for you?
No, I have no regrets. I have certain kinds of regrets, but they wouldn't interest you, and they're of no great consequence. My regrets puzzle me because they're not momentous. You know, the great crimes that I have committed against people, I am indifferent to. It's the small crimes that I committed that fascinate me. So, you know, there's a dream that haunts me to this day of how I really wounded and disappointed a girl when she was 18. I can't get it out of my head. How I could have been such a creep? The answer is easy. I was 18.
You were 18.
I was full of myself, and I was up in my eyeballs and drink.
Listen, at 18, that's fine. But if you're older, a lot of my girlfriends will tell you that they're dealing with that in their 30s and 40s. Is there a story that you haven't yet written that you really want to get around to?
There's a short novel I'm thinking of. See, I have two novellas. One is this I told you about previously, all set in the mind of a woman, and it's set in the country, actually, out in the Ontario landscape. Then there's another story which I love, called Never Is Just the Echo of Forever, which was printed in a volume called A Kiss Is Still a Kiss. And if this weren't already 500 pages, I would have printed it here, except that would have made the book 650 pages, which is intolerable. No one can hold 650 pages. So I would like to reprint those two stories, but to do that, I would like to also have a third novella. And I have a kind of novella in mind right now that I'm tinkering with, starting. I've got one other thing I have to, I'm probably going to try and write a short book about what it was like to be with Claire when she was dying, which will be difficult, is difficult already. We'll see whether I can do it. If I can't do it, then I'll just go to the novel. I'll probably do it. But those are the two things that I'm thinking of writing. But to go back to the novel, that novelette, which would be about 100 pages, to go with the other novelettes. That's what I'm looking forward to.
Well, to be a little selfish for us.
Before I die.
Well, to be a little selfish for us, if once you do that, we hope that you can come back. It's been such a pleasure to speak to you.
You let me ramble on like this?
No, it was so great.
I'll come back tomorrow. What the hell?
Anytime.
It must look like I don't get out much.
No. We've learned so much from you, and it's a fantastic collection of stories.
Well,
Thank you
very
Callaghan.
much for that.
It's been a pleasure.
The Agenda in the Summer with Nam Kiwanuka is brought to you by the Chartered Professional Accountants of Ontario. CPA Ontario is a regulator, an educator, a thought leader, and an advocate. We protect the public. We advance our profession. We guide our CPAs. We are CPA Ontario, and by viewers like you. Thank you.